September 4, 476 AD. The last Roman emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, hands over his crown to a barbarian general. No battle, no siege, just a quiet surrender in a palace that had once ruled the known world. The Roman Empire, which had dominated Western civilization for over 1,000 years, which had built roads we still drive on and laws we still follow, simply ceased to exist. Europe plunged into what would later be called the Dark Ages. But what if it hadn't? What if, in that moment, something different happened? To understand what was lost, we must first understand what Rome was. At its peak in the 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire controlled the entire Mediterranean world. From Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Mesopotamia, 1/4 of all humans on Earth lived under Roman rule. Rome wasn't just a military power. It was an idea. Roman law gave citizens rights that wouldn't exist again for over 1,000 years. Roman engineering built roads, aqueducts, and buildings that still stand today. Roman culture unified dozens of peoples and languages under a common civilization. If you're fascinated by the moments that changed everything, subscribe. We explore alternate timelines every week. But empires don't fall in a day. They rot from within long before the final blow lands. By the 3rd century, Rome was in crisis. In just 50 years, over 26 emperors took the throne, most killed by their own soldiers or rivals. The once invincible legions spent more time fighting each other than defending the borders. The economy collapsed. Emperors paid for civil wars by debasing the currency, mixing less and less silver into coins until money itself became worthless. Trade networks that had connected the empire for centuries broke down. Cities that had thrived for generations began to empty, and on every frontier, Rome's enemies watched and waited. In 476 AD, something terrifying appeared on the eastern steppes. The Huns, nomadic warriors from Central Asia, swept into Gothic territory with a ferocity Europe had never seen. Entire nations fled before them. The Goths, hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children, appeared at the Danube River, begging for permission to enter Roman territory. The Emperor Valens agreed to let them in, hoping to use them as soldiers and farmers. It was a catastrophic mistake. Roman officials exploited the desperate refugees, selling them dog meat for gold, even selling their children into slavery. Within 2 years, the Goths revolted. The empire would never fully recover. August 24, 410 AD. For the first time in 800 years, a foreign army entered Rome. Alaric and his Visigoths didn't destroy the city. They looted it for 3 days, then left. Churches were spared. Many citizens survived. By the standards of ancient warfare, it was almost gentle. But the psychological impact was devastating. Rome was supposed to be eternal. The city that had conquered the world was not supposed to fall. Across the Mediterranean, people heard the news and wept. St. Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, asked, "If Rome can perish, what can be safe?" The answer, as it turned out, was nothing. After 410, the Western Empire entered its death spiral. Province after province fell away. The Vandals took North Africa, Rome's breadbasket. The Visigoths took Spain. The Franks, Burgundians, and Alemanni carved up Gaul. In 455, the Vandals sacked Rome again, this time taking everything valuable, including the treasures Titus had looted from Jerusalem 4 centuries earlier. They stripped bronze tiles from temple roofs. They took the empress herself as a hostage. The last Western emperors were children and puppets, controlled by barbarian generals who didn't bother to take the title themselves. The empire had become a hollow shell, an idea without substance. And then, in 476, even the shell cracked. Odoacer wasn't a conqueror in the traditional sense. He was a Germanic general who had served in the Roman army, leading other Germanic soldiers who made up most of Rome's remaining military. When his troops demanded land and were refused, Odoacer simply took power. He didn't sack cities or massacre populations. He sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, acknowledging the Eastern Emperor as the sole Roman ruler. He kept the Senate, kept the bureaucracy, kept the forms of Roman government. But everyone knew something fundamental had changed. The line of Western emperors that stretched back to Augustus, to Caesar, to the legendary founders of Rome itself had ended. Not with a bang, but with a teenager's quiet surrender. What was your theory before I continue? Drop your thoughts in the comments. What followed the fall wasn't immediately catastrophic, but over the next few centuries, Western Europe experienced a collapse that touches us still. Population plummeted. Cities that had held hundreds of thousands shrank to a few thousand or were abandoned entirely. Rome itself, which had once housed over 1 million people, fell to perhaps 20,000. Trade networks collapsed. Literacy declined dramatically. Technologies that Romans had taken for granted, central heating, running water, concrete, were forgotten. The ability to read and write became so rare that kings signed documents with an X. This wasn't inevitable. The Eastern Roman Empire, which we call Byzantium, survived and thrived for another 1,000 years. The knowledge existed, the potential remained. But in the West, the light went out. Unless, of course, it didn't. In this timeline, the message to Constantinople arrives differently. Perhaps the Eastern Emperor Zeno sees an opportunity rather than a burden. Perhaps he remembers that a strong Western ally protects Byzantium's own flanks. A fleet sails from Constantinople, not a conquering army, but a reinforcement. Odoacer, facing a united Roman front rather than an isolated puppet, chooses negotiation over confrontation. He gets his land grants, but within the imperial system, as a federate general rather than a replacement king. Romulus Augustulus remains on the throne. The Western Empire survives, but survival is just the beginning. The near-death experience forces reform. The Western government, finally understanding how close it came to extinction, implements changes that had been resisted for generations. The army is rebuilt, but differently. Germanic warriors who had been unreliable mercenaries are integrated fully, given land and citizenship in exchange for military service. The distinction between Roman and barbarian begins to blur, but the loyalty to Rome strengthens. The tax system is overhauled. Corrupt officials are purged. The grain supply from Africa is secured through new treaties and naval power. Cities that had been dying begin to stabilize. It's not a return to the glory of Augustus. That's impossible. But it's not collapse either. The 6th century brings challenges that would have destroyed the old Western Empire. The Franks are rising in Gaul. The Ostrogoths control Italy's northern frontier. The Lombards press from the east. Alliances with the Eastern Empire, careful diplomacy with barbarian kingdoms, and a rebuilt military allow the Western government to hold its core territories. Italy, southern Gaul, Spain, and Africa remain Roman. It's a smaller empire than the one Augustus ruled, but it's stable. And stability allows something precious: recovery. In our timeline, the monasteries saved what fragments of classical knowledge they could. But imagine if the Roman state itself had survived to preserve its heritage. The great libraries don't burn or crumble, the schools don't close. The tradition of classical education continues unbroken. A young person in 6th century Rome can still learn Greek philosophy, Roman law, and mathematical principles from teachers whose students would become teachers themselves. The scientific and philosophical works of antiquity aren't scattered fragments to be rediscovered 1,000 years later. They're living traditions, studied, debated, and built upon by generation after generation. This changes everything. The Romans had all the prerequisites for an industrial revolution. They had Hero's steam engine, a working prototype that was treated as a toy. They had concrete, glass-making, mining technology, and a literate workforce. They had roads and trade networks to distribute goods. What they lacked was pressure. With slaves available for labor, there was no incentive to develop labor-saving machines. With the empire secure, there was no military need for technological advancement. But an empire that nearly died, that had to fight for every inch of territory, might think differently. An empire that lost half its population might desperately need machines to replace missing workers. In this timeline, Roman engineers don't just maintain what exists, they innovate, they experiment, they build. Christianity was already the state religion when the Western Empire fell. But the church that emerged from the Dark Ages was shaped by that catastrophe, by the need to preserve what it could in a world of chaos. One that remains more integrated with classical learning, less hostile to pagan philosophy. One where the Bishop of Rome shares authority with a living emperor rather than claiming the vacuum left by Rome's fall. But the context is different. Christianity evolves as a Roman religion, not as the inheritor of a dead civilization. By the year 1000, this alternate Western Roman Empire looks nothing like the one Augustus founded. But it hasn't collapsed either. It has evolved. The population has recovered and grown. The economy is diversified, no longer dependent on conquest and slavery, but on trade, manufacturing, and innovation. Something like constitutional limits has emerged from centuries of negotiation between emperors, generals, and citizens. It's not a democracy, but it's not a tyranny either. It's something new, grown from Roman roots, but adapted to changed circumstances. In our timeline, it was Spanish caravels that reached the Americas in 1492. But in a world where the Western Roman Empire survived, who makes that voyage? Perhaps it's still ships from the Iberian Peninsula, but flying Roman eagles rather than Castilian lions. Perhaps the explorers carry with them a civilization that never experienced the Dark Ages, that has 1,000 extra years of accumulated knowledge and technology. The encounter with the Americas would still be devastating for indigenous peoples. Disease alone would ensure that. But the nature of colonization might differ. A civilization with a continuous legal tradition, with concepts of citizenship developed over 2 millennia, might approach the New World differently than the conquistadors did, or might not. If the Romans had continued developing technology, if the scientific and engineering traditions had never been interrupted, when would they have achieved industrialization? Perhaps by the 12th or 13th century, technologies we associate with the 18th and 19th centuries would have emerged. Mass manufacturing, rail transport, telegraph communication. The social consequences would be similar to what we experienced. Would a society that had never lost its classical heritage handle industrialization better than we did? Or would the same problems emerge regardless? What would the 20th century look like in a world where Rome never fell? Would there have been world wars? Perhaps the conflicts would have been different, between different powers, over different ideologies. But human nature doesn't change. Competition, nationalism, ideology, these forces would still exist, just wearing different masks. Would there have been a Rome that embraced fascism, as Mussolini tried to create? Or would 2,000 years of constitutional evolution have produced antibodies against tyranny? but the speculation reveals something important about our own history. The fall of Rome wasn't just the end of an empire. It was the loss of nearly 1,000 years of human progress. In our timeline, it took until the Renaissance, nearly 1,000 years, for European civilization to begin recovering what Rome had achieved. Population didn't reach Roman levels again until the 17th or 18th century. Some technologies weren't rediscovered until the modern era. Think about that. 1,000 years. 30 generations of humans lived shorter, harder, poorer lives because of what was lost. Countless potential geniuses never learned to read. Countless innovations were never made. Countless lives were never lived. The Dark Ages weren't inevitable. They were a catastrophe that didn't have to happen. Historians have debated for centuries why Rome fell. Was it the barbarian invasions, economic collapse, lead poisoning, Christianity, moral decay, climate change? The answer is probably all of these and more. Complex systems don't fail for single reasons. They fail when multiple stresses accumulate faster than the system can adapt. But that very complexity means the outcome wasn't inevitable. A different decision here, a different leader there, a plague that didn't happen, a battle that went the other way. Any of these might have changed everything. History is not a story of inevitability. It's a story of contingency. The world we live in is not the only world that could have been. Even in our timeline, even after the fall, Rome never really died. Our legal systems are built on Roman law. Our architecture echoes Roman temples. Our languages descend from Latin. Our very concept of citizenship comes from Rome. The Western Roman Empire fell in 476. But the idea of Rome proved harder to kill. Charlemagne claimed to revive it. The Holy Roman Empire claimed its mantle. Napoleon crowned himself like a Caesar. Even the word Kaiser is just Caesar in German. Heirs to a civilization that shaped the world and continues to shape it, even from its grave. What if Romulus Augustulus had fought back? What if the Eastern Empire had helped? What if any of 1,000 different decisions had been made differently? We would live in a different world. A world with continuous classical civilization. A world without the Dark Ages. A world where the scientific revolution might have come 1,000 years earlier. Better? Worse? We can't know. History doesn't offer controlled experiments. We can only look at what happened and wonder about what didn't. The Roman Empire fell because it could, because empires are fragile things, built by humans and subject to all the failures humans are capable of. Because no civilization, no matter how mighty, is guaranteed survival. The story of Rome's fall is a warning. Civilizations can die. Progress is not inevitable. What has been built can be lost. But it's also a story of resilience, of how something can be destroyed and yet somehow survive. And Rome never fell at all. Both things are true. The Western Roman Empire ruled for over 500 years. It's been gone for over 1,500. And we're still talking about it, still learning from it, still arguing about why it fell and what it means. Not the immortality the emperors wanted, but perhaps a more honest one. Rome survives not in its power, but in its influence. Not in its legions, but in its ideas. The fall of Rome teaches us that nothing lasts forever, but it also teaches us that some things last longer than we expect, that even fallen empires cast long shadows, that the past is never really past. Next week, we're exploring what would have happened if the Black Death had killed 90% of Europe instead of 30%. Subscribe so you don't miss when history takes another turn. Until then, I'll see you in the next timeline.